The bottom line is, once they did all that stuff, then they came in and exercised a warrant. And normally when they exercise a federal warrant against a business, that business doesn't reopen. Well, I opened the next day and said, hey, the IRS came and we're having a sale. Come on down, get your guns, get your holsters, get your ammo, get your stuff. Let's go.
Once celebrated as a family man and gun expert, Richard Wyatt's world unraveled through scandal, betrayal, and prison. His downfall surprised fans everywhere, leaving behind whispers of goodbye forever. The Wyatt family and American guns. When Discovery Channel introduced American Guns in the fall of 2011, it quickly became one of the most talked-about reality shows on television. The series ran for 2 seasons and a total of 26 episodes, with its finale airing in December of 2012. At the heart of the show was the Wyatt family, whose lives revolved around their gun shop, Gunsmoke Guns, located in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. The program gave viewers a close look at the daily business of buying, selling, and customizing firearms. Rich Wyatt, the head of the family, stood out as the bold and confident leader, often at the center of the action. Beside him was his wife Renee, who balanced the family side of the shop with its customer dealings. Completing the team were Kurt and Paige, Rich's stepchildren, who brought youthful energy and a fresh spark to the business. Together, they turned ordinary episodes into something dramatic, mixing work, family bonds, and the thrill of firearms culture. What set the show apart from other reality programs was the way Gunsmoke operated, more like a workshop of imagination than a regular gun store. Customers brought in ideas and requests, and the Wyatt family transformed them into custom pieces. From carefully engraved firearms to bold modifications, the show displayed creativity that fascinated viewers. The family also staged firing competitions and demonstrated how their creations performed, adding excitement to each episode. The Wyatts crafted an image that appealed to many fans across the country. They were presented as a suburban family with extraordinary skills, tied together by love for each other and passion for their craft. Viewers watched them travel in helicopters to chase rare finds, bargain over historic pieces, and welcome well-known guests, including famous names from the music world. These elements gave the show the sense of glamour and adventure that kept audiences coming back week after week. But the rise of American Guns was short-lived. In December of 2012, the network abruptly canceled the show. Although Discovery Channel did not release a detailed explanation, the timing made it clear that the decision came in the aftermath of the tragic Sandy Hook Elementary School firing. With public emotions running high over firearms, a program centered on guns no longer fit the cultural moment. His rise seemed unstoppable, yet everything began to unravel. What truly went wrong, and why does Wyatt's journey end with a goodbye forever? Legal troubles begin. After the bright lights of television faded, life for Rich Wyatt and his family began to change in unexpected and troubling ways. The business that once looked glamorous on screen was soon caught in a storm of investigations, raids, and suspicion. What had once been a stage for entertainment turned into the center of a legal drama that would haunt the Wyatts for years. The trouble first came in February of 2013 when Gunsmoke Guns, their well-known store in Wheat Ridge, was struck by a bold burglary. Thieves cut through the roof of the building and made off with 12 handguns and 3 rifles. The break-in shocked the family, the community, and those who had admired the shop from afar. It was not just the loss of weapons that raised alarm, but the daring way the crime was carried out. The theft brought unwanted attention, and it marked the beginning of a chain of events that would slowly unravel the Wyatt family's public image. Only days after the burglary, the situation grew heavier. Agents from the Internal Revenue Service arrived with a search warrant. This was not a sudden move, but part of a long-running financial investigation that had quietly been building in the background. The presence of federal agents at Gunsmoke Guns sent a clear signal that more than stolen firearms was at stake. The family, once known for television fame, was now facing questions about money, taxes, and business practices. For a time, the shop carried on, but the sense of uncertainty lingered. Then, in March of 2015, the troubles deepened. This time it was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives that came knocking. The ATF conducted a raid on Gunsmoke Guns, and the action left no doubt that the business was under intense federal scrutiny. Soon after, the store that had once been showcased on national television was shuttered, closing its doors and cutting short the life of a place that had once seemed unstoppable. The raids and investigations marked the end of an era. What had started as a daring burglary led to the exposure of larger troubles waiting beneath the surface. The family that once drew viewers with creativity and charm now found themselves fighting shadows of suspicion and facing a future that looked far more uncertain than the one they had once built on screen. What truly shocked the public were the heavy allegations leveled against Wyatt. But was he genuinely guilty of every single charge, or was there more to the story? Federal indictment and conviction. By the year 2016, the troubles surrounding Rich Wyatt reached a breaking point. After years of quiet investigations and the dramatic raids on his gun shop, the federal government was ready to act. On February 9th of that year, a grand jury delivered an indictment that changed the course of Wyatt's life forever. The charges laid against him were heavy. He was accused of conspiracy to deal in firearms without holding a proper license, tax evasion, filing false tax returns, and failing to file required returns. For someone who had once stood proudly in front of television cameras as the face of American guns, these accusations pulled him into the harsh spotlight of federal courtrooms. The details were damaging. Federal prosecutors alleged that Wyatt had failed to report more than $1 million in income over the years between 2009 and 2012. Instead of paying what he owed, he filed false returns that hid his earnings from the Internal Revenue Service. To make matters worse, after he surrendered his federal firearms license in 2012, he allegedly continued selling guns through the use of another license holder, a practice sometimes described as using a straw license. These actions, if proven, not only broke financial laws, but also violated the strict rules that govern the gun trade in America. The stage was set for a courtroom battle that would decide his fate. In March of 2017, Wyatt stood trial. The proceedings lasted 6 full days, and every moment brought more pressure to a man who once lived in the glow of celebrity. The jury listened, weighed the evidence, and in the end, reached a conclusion that struck hard. At 53 years old, Wyatt was found guilty on 10 felony counts. These included conspiracy and multiple tax-related charges, confirming that the government's case had convinced the court. The verdict carried immediate consequences. The judge did not allow Wyatt the comfort of returning home to wait for his punishment. Instead, he was taken directly into custody. The man who had once walked freely through his famous gun shop was now led away under the watch of federal officers. Sentencing was scheduled for later in the year, but the outcome of the trial had already sealed his fate. Wyatt's empire had already begun to crumble, but his sentence sealed his downfall. What was the punishment, and how deep did the impact cut? The fall of a Gunsmoke star. By the time the gavel fell on March 8th of 2018, the fate of Rich Wyatt was sealed. After being found guilty the previous year, the long wait for sentencing ended with a decision that would define the next chapter of his life. The courtroom, filled with tension, listened as the judge laid out the punishment for a man once known to millions through television. The sentence was heavy but decisive. Wyatt was ordered to serve 78 months in federal prison. That meant 6.5 years behind bars, with no chance of walking away from the consequences of his actions. After completing his prison time, he would also face 3 years of supervised release, a reminder that even after freedom, the government would continue to watch closely. The punishment was designed to ensure that his fall from grace came with real accountability. The court went further than just time behind bars. It ordered the forfeiture of 490 firearms that had been tied to the offenses. For someone whose identity and public image were built on the world of guns, the loss of such a large collection carried a symbolic weight. It marked a sharp break between the man who once stood as a public face of gun culture and the man now stripped of his rights within the justice system. Financial penalties were also part of the case. While the judge did not finalize restitution at the sentencing, the decision was made to defer the amount owed to the Internal Revenue Service until a later hearing. This left open the possibility of another financial blow, one that would demand repayment for the more than $1 million in income Wyatt had failed to report. The case drew wide coverage. Outlets such as CBS, AP News, and Westward reported on the sentencing, reminding the public of how far Wyatt had fallen. They highlighted the ways he had hidden money from the government and how he had continued to sell firearms through a straw license after losing his federal license. The media attention painted a stark picture of the distance between his days as a reality television star and his life as a convicted felon. In the courtroom, Wyatt tried to show remorse. He admitted that he had not completed his paperwork properly and that he had not paid his fair share. The judge, however, was not convinced that his apology showed true understanding. She noted that his words seemed to reveal more regret about being caught than real sorrow for what he had done. It was a final reminder that accountability had come too late. With the sentence handed down, Wyatt was led away to begin his prison term. Aftermath and goodbye forever. When the prison doors finally opened for Rich Wyatt in early July of 2020, the world he stepped back into was not the same one he had left. Years behind bars had changed his public image, his personal freedom, and the course of his life. Once a household face from television, Wyatt emerged a man marked by conviction and loss, carrying the weight of choices that had reshaped his story forever. His release came under a plea agreement tied to a single tax count, which gave him credit for the time already served and allowed him to transition into supervised release. Though technically free, it was freedom with conditions, a reminder that his past would never completely loosen its grip. For a while, his name faded from the spotlight. Unlike his days on national television, there were no cameras chasing his every move. Yet, true to form, Wyatt would not remain silent for long. Slowly but surely, he found his way back into the public sphere, though in a different role than before. The stage was no longer a gun shop or a reality show, but the world of politics. In February of 2025, Wyatt made headlines again, this time as the newly elected chair of the Jefferson County Republican Party. It was a surprising reemergence, proof that despite scandal and prison, he still had the ability to command attention and rally support. For some, it was a comeback. For others, it was a reminder of his past, one that was hard to forget. Along the way, Wyatt also tried to rebuild what had been stripped from him. Reports noted that he had sought a presidential pardon from Donald Trump, hoping to restore his rights and once again hold firearms legally. That effort failed, leaving him without the ability to reconnect with the very symbol that had defined so much of his identity. Guns, which once brought him fame, profit, and controversy, remained out of reach. Even in his return to public life, Wyatt could not escape the shadow of his past. He admitted to the tax evasion that had played a central role in his conviction, but he continued to reject responsibility for the firearms-related charges. At times, he framed himself as a victim of a system that had singled him out. His words struck differently depending on the listener. Some viewed them as a man fighting to restore his dignity, while others saw them as an attempt to rewrite a painful history. However, this is not the first controversy Wyatt has been faced with, but how did it all destroy his reputation? A badge lost and a reputation shattered. Before Rich Wyatt became known on television screens across the country, his career path led him through law enforcement. For a time, he carried the title of chief of police in the small mountain town of Alma, Colorado. It was a respected position, one that gave him authority and a voice in the community. Yet, what could have been the foundation of a proud legacy soon crumbled under the weight of scandal and poor decisions. The downfall began in the early 2000s when Wyatt was tangled in a bitter divorce case. Court orders were issued, and instead of following them, he openly defied the law he was sworn to uphold. His actions led to contempt of court charges and drew unwanted attention to his personal life. By 2002, the situation had spiraled beyond repair. The result was not a graceful retirement from his post as many later assumed. Instead, he was fired outright, dismissed from the very position that had given him authority. This abrupt end stained his credibility, both as a leader and as a man who was expected to set an example of integrity. Losing the badge should have marked the close of his law enforcement story. Yet Wyatt did not seem ready to let go of the identity that had once given him power. Reports suggest that he refused to return his badge after being terminated. More troubling, he continued to present himself as though he still carried the weight of law behind him. On at least one occasion, he is said to have misrepresented himself as an active officer, a decision that only added to the cracks in his reputation. For a man already under scrutiny, this behavior painted him as someone unwilling to accept accountability, and it deepened the doubts about his trustworthiness. The consequences of this period reached far beyond Alma. When Wyatt later re-emerged in the spotlight with his family's reality show, the shadow of his past was never fully erased. Viewers and critics alike saw not just a businessman and television star, but also a former officer whose career had collapsed under scandal. The credibility issues that started with his firing would later echo loudly when federal investigations came knocking. In truth, this chapter marked the first major warning sign that Wyatt's relationship with authority, rules, and accountability was deeply flawed. But the troubles did not end with the law. At home, Wyatt's marriage revealed struggles that would leave lasting scars. Scars of a broken marriage. Long before television fame and legal battles with federal agents, Rich Wyatt was already entangled in personal struggles that left marks on his public reputation. One of the most damaging chapters came not from his business ventures or his time in law enforcement, but from the fallout of his divorce. The separation from his former wife, who was also the mother of his stepchildren, unfolded in a way that drew unwanted attention and eventually led to his arrest. Divorce is often messy, but in Wyatt's case, the proceedings were marked by defiance and a willingness to push against the boundaries of the law. The court had ordered him to return personal belongings to his ex-wife, including cherished family photographs. Instead of complying fully, Wyatt reportedly gave back only part of what was required. What made matters worse was the state in which some of the return photos were delivered. Instead of being handed back intact, they were defaced with inappropriate remarks. What should have been simple compliance with a legal order became an act that revealed deep bitterness and disregard for the process. This behavior did not go unnoticed. Courts take violations of orders seriously, especially in contentious divorce cases where emotions already run high. By failing to follow through as instructed and by adding a layer of disrespect, Wyatt set himself up for consequences that would go far beyond the private walls of a family dispute. The end result was his arrest on contempt of court charges. This was not just a personal embarrassment. It became another public mark against his character. For a man who once wore the uniform of a police officer and carried the title of chief, being taken into custody over such actions made it harder for him to maintain any image of credibility or discipline. In hindsight, this incident reflected a pattern that seemed to follow Wyatt through different stages of his life. His unwillingness to follow orders, his tendency to test boundaries, and his defiant approach toward authority would resurface later in more serious circumstances. The divorce fallout was only the beginning, but it showed the cracks in his public image long before his name became known nationwide. The shadow of theft. By the year 2015, Richard Wyatt's life had already been tangled in scrutiny. But matters grew darker when a new accusation surfaced, one that shook both his reputation and his remaining circle of trust. He was arrested on a warrant tied to theft from an at-risk adult, a charge that painted him in an even harsher light. The story behind the charge was unusual and unsettling. Wyatt had accepted a rare and valuable antique gun collection from a person who trusted him enough to place it on consignment. In such an arrangement, the seller leaves their items with a dealer, who then sells them and returns the proceeds or, if unsold, gives back the items. It is a system that runs on trust, honesty, and transparency. Yet, in Wyatt's case, the items were not returned as promised. For the person who owned them, this was not just about lost property. It was about a betrayal of confidence, especially as the individual was categorized as an at-risk adult, making the issue all the more serious in the eyes of the law. This charge added another layer of trouble to Wyatt's already crumbling world. The once celebrated television personality who had built his fame around firearms was now entangled in a situation that made him appear careless with integrity and responsibility. His arrest served as another blow to his public image, amplifying the sense that the man viewers had admired on screen was far different from the man dealing with mounting accusations off camera. The theft case showed how quickly trust can vanish when promises are broken. For Wyatt, it was yet another chapter in a downward spiral that left fans and critics wondering if redemption was even possible. Wyatt's consignment scandal. Richard Wyatt's story was never only about courtrooms and federal charges. Long before his sentencing, cracks were already forming in his public image. What made things worse was not just the legal scrutiny, but also the steady stream of criticism and rumors that surrounded him and his beloved Gunsmoke guns. These shadows made it clear that even without the verdicts, Wyatt was facing a tough battle in the court of public opinion. Back in the early days of the IRS investigation, whispers emerged suggesting that the government's focus on Wyatt may have been influenced by his strong stance against gun control laws. A writer from the Colorado Conservative Examiner speculated whether the tax probe was politically charged, arguing that Wyatt's loud opposition to certain legislation may have put a target on his back. While these claims remained opinions rather than proven facts, they added fuel to the idea that Wyatt was being singled out not just for financial missteps, but for his outspoken political identity. For his supporters, this became a rallying cry. For critics, however, it was just another excuse. At the same time, everyday customers began sharing experiences that painted a far less flattering picture of Gunsmoke guns culture. Hobbyists and gun enthusiasts voiced frustration online, describing the shop as overpriced, elitist, and dismissive. Some recounted walking in only to feel belittled by staff who, instead of welcoming them, lectured about the quality of their products, while mocking anyone interested in budget-friendly firearms. These stories suggested that the atmosphere of Gunsmoke was less about community and more about prestige, a place where customers either impressed Wyatt and his team or walked away insulted. For many locals, that attitude left a sour taste that money or marketing could not fix. The backlash did not end with store reviews. On forums like Reddit, anonymous voices added more fuel to Wyatt's already growing controversies. Stories circulated of alleged road rage incidents, with some claiming he damaged another driver's car and quietly settled the matter to avoid exposure. Others described him as having a temper that frequently boiled over, reinforcing the picture of a man whose frustrations extended beyond the walls of his gun shop. Although these accounts were never verified, the sheer number of them fed into his reputation as someone constantly teetering between charm and confrontation. When combined, these layers of criticism, political suspicion, customer dissatisfaction, and local rumors painted a portrait of a man who was never quite free from conflict. Whether through his fiery public positions, his store's unwelcoming atmosphere, or whispers of bad behavior on the streets, Wyatt's brand carried as much controversy as it did fame. By the time his legal troubles reached the headlines, much of the community had already formed their verdict. To some, Wyatt was a victim targeted for his politics and passion. To others, he was a man whose arrogance and poor decisions caught up with him. Either way, the public backlash had already ensured that Wyatt's battles would never be confined to a courtroom. They were woven into the very fabric of his public identity. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.